The Irish War of Independence or Anglo-Irish War was a guerrilla war fought from 1919 to 1921 between the Irish Republican Army and the British security forces in Ireland. It was an escalation of the Irish Revolutionary period into armed conflict. In the December 1918 election, the Irish Republican Party Sinn Féin won a landslide victory in Ireland. On the 21st of January 1919 they formed a breakaway government and declared independence from Britain. Later that day, two members of the armed police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, were shot dead in County Tipperary by IRA members acting on their own initiative. This is often seen as the beginning of the conflict. For much of 1919, IRA activity primarily involved capturing weapons and freeing Republican prisoners. In September that year, the British government outlawed the Dáil and Sinn Féin, and the conflict intensified thereafter. The IRA began ambushing RIC and British Army patrols, attacking the barracks and forcing isolated barracks to be abandoned. The British government bolstered the RIC with recruits from Britain, the Black and Tanzan auxiliaries, who became notorious for ill discipline and reprisal attacks on civilians. The conflict as a result is often referred to as the Black and Tan War or simply the Tan War. While around 300 people had been killed in the conflict up to late 1920, there was a major escalation of violence in November that year. On Bloody Sunday, the 21st of November 1920, 14 British intelligence operatives were assassinated in Dublin in the morning. Then in the afternoon the RIC opened fire on a crowd at a football match in the city, killing 14 civilians and wounding 65. A week later, 17 auxiliaries were killed by the IRA in an ambush at Kilmichael in County Cork. The British government declared martial law in much of southern Ireland. The centre of Cork City was burnt out by British forces in December 1920. Violence continued to escalate over the next 7 months, when 1,000 people were killed and 4,500 Republicans were interned. The fighting was heavily concentrated in Munster, Dublin and Belfast. These three locations saw over 75% of the conflict's fatalities. Violence in Ulster, especially Belfast, was notable for its sectarian character and its high number of Catholic civilian victims. Both sides agreed to a truce on the 11th of July 1921. In May, Ireland had been partitioned by and Act of the British Parliament, which created Northern Ireland, despite the fact that County Fermanagh, Tyrone, Derry City and border regions had voted by a majority for Nationalist candidates in the 1918 general election. The post-ceasefire talks led to the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty on 6 December 1921. This treaty ended British rule in 26 counties of Ireland, and, after a 10-month transitional period overseen by a provisional government, the Irish Free State was created as a self-governing state with dominion status on 6 December 1922. However, 6 northeastern counties remained within the United Kingdom. After the ceasefire, political and sectarian violence between Republicans and Loyalists continued in Northern Ireland for many months. In June 1922, disagreement among Republicans over the Anglo-Irish Treaty led to an 11-month civil war. The Irish Free State awarded 62,868 medals for service during the War of Independence, of which 15,224 were issued to fighting men of the flying columns. Origins of the conflict. Home Rule crisis. Since the 1880s, Irish nationalists in the Irish Parliamentary Party had been demanding Home Rule, or self-government, from Britain. Fringe organisations, such as Arthur Griffith's Sinn Féin instead argued for some form of Irish independence, but they were in a small minority. The demand for Home Rule was eventually granted by the British government in 1912, immediately prompting a prolonged crisis within the United Kingdom as Ulster Unionists formed an armed organisation, the Ulster Volunteers, to resist this measure of devolution, at least in territory they could control. In turn, nationalists formed their own paramilitary organisation, the Irish Volunteers. The British Parliament passed the Third Home Rule Act on 18 September 1914 with an amending bill for the partition of Ireland introduced by Ulster Unionist MPs, but the Act's implementation was immediately postponed by the Suspensory Act 1914 due to the outbreak of the First World War in the previous month. The majority of nationalists followed their IPP leaders and John Redmond's call to support Britain and the Allied war effort in Irish regiments of the new British Army, the intention being to ensure the commencement of Home Rule after the war. But a significant minority of the Irish Volunteers opposed Ireland's involvement in the war. The volunteer movement split, a majority leaving to form the National Volunteers under Redmond. The remaining Irish Volunteers, under Owen McNeill, held that they would maintain their organisation until Home Rule had been granted. Within this volunteer movement, another faction, led by the separatist Irish Republican Brotherhood, began to prepare for a revolt against British rule in Ireland. Easter Rising. The plan for revolt was realised in the Easter Rising of 1916, in which the volunteers, now explicitly declaring a republic, launched an insurrection whose aim was to end British rule and to found an Irish republic. The Rising, in which over 400 people died, was almost exclusively confined to Dublin and was put down within a week. But the British response, executing the leaders of the insurrection and arresting thousands of nationalist activists, galvanized support for the separatist Sinn Féin, the party which the Republicans first adopted and then took over. By now, support for the British war effort was on the wane, and Irish public opinion was shocked and outraged by some of the actions committed by British troops, particularly the murder of Francis Sheehy Scaffington and the imposition of wartime martial law. The Proclamation of the Republic, issued at the outset of the Rising, was invoked in the Declaration of Independence in 1919 as the basis for the establishment of the Irish Republic. First, Dale in April 1918, the British cabinet, in the face of the crisis caused by the German Spring Offensive, attempted with a dual policy to simultaneously link the enactment of conscription into Ireland with the implementation of Home Rule, as outlined in the report of the Irish Convention of 8 April 1918. This further alienated Irish nationalists and produced mass demonstrations during the conscription crisis of 1918. In the 1918 general election, Irish voters showed their disapproval of British policy by giving Sinn Féin 70% of Irish seats, 25 of these uncontested. Sinn Féin won 91% of the seats outside of Ulster on 46.9% of votes cast, but was in a minority in Ulster, where Unionists were in a majority. Sinn Féin pledged not to sit in the UK Parliament at Westminster, but rather to set up an Irish Parliament. This Parliament, known as the First Dáil, and its ministry, called the Airy Act, consisting only of Sinn Féin members, met at the Mansion House on 21 January 1919. The Dáil reaffirmed the 1916 Proclamation with the Declaration of Independence, and issued a message to the free nations of the world, which stated that there was an existing state of war between Ireland and England. The Irish Volunteers were reconstituted as the Irish Republican Army, or IRA. The IRA was perceived by some members of Dáil Éireann to have a mandate to wage war on the British Dublin Castle administration forces. British and Unionist. The heart of British power in Ireland was the Dublin Castle administration, often known to the Irish as the Castle. The head of the Castle administration was the Lord Lieutenant, to whom a Chief Secretary was responsible, leading, in the words of the British historian Peter Cottle, to an administration renowned for its incompetence and inefficiency. Ireland was divided into 3 military districts. During the course of the war, 2 British divisions, the 5th and the 6th, were based in Ireland with the respective headquarters in the Curragh and Cork. By July 1921 there were 50,000 British troops based in Ireland. By contrast, there were 14,000 soldiers in metropolitan Britain. The 2 main police forces in Ireland were the Royal Irish Constabulary and the Dublin Metropolitan Police. Of the 17,000 policemen in Ireland, 513 were killed by the IRA between 1919 to 21, while 682 were wounded. Of the RIC's senior officers, 60% were Irish Protestants and rest Catholic, while 70% of the rank and file of the RIC were Irish Catholic, with the rest Protestant. The RIC was trained for police work, not war, and was woefully ill-prepared to take on counter-insurgency duties. Until March 1920, London regarded the unrest in Ireland as primarily an issue for the police and did not regard it as a war. The purpose of the army was to back up the police. During the course of the war, about a quarter of Ireland was put under martial law, mostly in Munster. In rest of the country, British authority was not deemed sufficiently threatened to warrant it. During the course of the war, the British created 2 paramilitary police forces to supplement the work of the RIC, recruited mostly from World War I veterans, namely the Temporary Constables and the Temporary Cadets or Auxiliary Division. Irish Nationalists and Republicans. On the 25th of November 1913, the Irish Volunteers were formed by Owen McNeill in response to the paramilitary Ulster Volunteer Force that had been founded earlier in the year to fight against Home Rule. Also in 1913, the Irish Citizen Army was founded by the trade unionist and socialist James Connolly following a series of violent incidents between trade unionists and the Dublin police in the Dublin lockout. In June 1914, Nationalist leader John Redmond forced the Volunteers to give his nominees a majority on the ruling committee. When, in September 1914, Redmond encouraged the Volunteers to enlist in the British Army, a faction led by Owen McNeill broke with the Redmondites, who became known as the National Volunteers, rather than fight for Britain in the war. Many of the National Volunteers did enlist, and the majority of the men in the 16th Division of the British Army had formerly served in the National Volunteers. The Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army launched the Easter Rising against British rule in 1916, when an Irish Republic was proclaimed. Thereafter they became known as the Irish Republican Army. Between 1919 to 21, the IRA claimed to have a total strength of 70,000, but only about 3,000 were actively engaged in fighting against the Crown. The IRA distrusted those Irishmen who had fought in the British Army during the First World War, but there were a number of exceptions such as Emmett Dalton, Tom Barry and Martin Doyle. The basic structure of the IRA was the flying column, which could number between 20 and 100 men. Finally, Michael Collins created the squad gunmen responsible to himself, who were assigned special duties such as the assassination of policemen and suspected informers within the IRA.